They thought they could humiliate him in the bar, but 30 seconds later, everything changed. None of them knew who they were dealing with, and now they will remember this evening forever. Subscribe and write in the comments where you are watching from. The rain had been falling for hours, a slow, persistent drizzle that blurred the edges of the landscape and dulled even the faintest lights of civilization. A narrow two-lane road carved its way through the sodden countryside, winding between skeletal trees and sagging fences. The asphalt shimmered under the glow of weak headlights, its black surface slick with water and pockmarked by years of neglect. Along the roadside, abandoned gas stations and rusted billboards stood as relics of a time when travelers might have once passed through in greater numbers. Now the only sound was the gentle percussion of rain against the windshield and the low hum of an old country song murmuring through the radio of a weathered black pickup truck. Behind the wheel sat a man who did not look as though he belonged to this decade, or perhaps any at all. His hands, though large and calloused, rested lightly on the wheel, his posture relaxed but precise. He was in no hurry. His eyes, sharp and watchful, scanned the road ahead without urgency, as if he were waiting for something, without knowing what it was. His face bore the lines of age, not the weakness of it, but the quiet power of experience. The rain didn't bother him. Neither did the creeping isolation of the place. He had seen lonelier roads. He had weathered harsher nights. The town, when it finally appeared, did so like a faded photograph developing in slow motion. It wasn't much. Just a few low buildings lining a main street. All of them quiet, most of them dark. A gutted hardware store with boards over the windows, a diner with its stools stacked on the counter, a single gas pump beneath a flickering light. The rain formed puddles on the uneven pavement, reflecting the blurred halos of the street lamps above. At the center of it all was a bar, the only source of real light. Its neon sign, cracked but defiant, buzzed and flashed. Iron Fang. The red letters flickered in and out of coherence, the F in Fang barely hanging on. From the outside, it looked like a relic from another era, a low timber building with peeling paint, a crooked porch, and a row of motorcycles leaning haphazardly against the railing. Through the fogged windows, a faint amber glow suggested life, or at least the illusion of it. The truck slowed and pulled into a space beside the curb. The man killed the engine and sat in silence for a moment, listening to the tick of cooling metal and the rain on the roof. Then he opened the door and stepped out. The wet air clung to him immediately, cold and metallic. His boots hit the pavement with a solid thud as he crossed the street and pushed open the door to the bar. Inside, the contrast was stark. The warmth, first of all, a dry, heavy heat that smelled of old whiskey, leather, and the residue of 1,000 cigarettes smoked in defiance of regulations. The lighting was low and amber, cast from mismatched hanging bulbs and a couple of old neon beer signs. The bar itself ran along one wall, a polished slab of dark wood scarred by generations of fists, bottles, and cigarette burns. Behind it, a row of dusty bottles stood at attention, their labels faded, their contents unpredictable. There were a few patrons scattered across the room. An old man nursed a pint near the window, his hat pulled low. A couple of locals sat over a quiet game of dominoes, their conversation muted and wary. The jukebox in the corner let out a crackle before switching to a melancholy blues track, the guitar wailing low and long. Nobody turned to look as the newcomer entered. Nobody said anything, but everyone noticed. He walked in without hesitation, his steps steady, his presence understated but undeniable. He chose a seat near the center, not too far from the bar, not too close to the door. He sat down with the composure of someone who had never rushed a decision in his life and rested his hands on the table as he scanned the room, taking in every detail without letting his eyes linger too long. Behind the bar stood a woman in her 60s, lean and erect despite the weight of time. Her hair was pulled back in a tight knot, and a pale scar ran down her left cheek, slicing through the years like a faded memory. She met the man's eyes for a second, then gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. Without a word, she poured a mug of hot coffee and brought it to him, placing it gently in front of him on the worn table. "You just passing through?" she asked quietly. He gave a slow nod. "Looks that way." "You picked a quiet night. I like quiet." She looked at him a moment longer, then returned behind the bar. The others in the room went back to their distractions, but there was an undercurrent now, a subtle shift in the air, a sense of expectation, as if something had tilted the balance of the room, though no one could say quite what. In the far corner, where the shadows pooled deepest, sat a group of 5 men young, loud and brimming with the kind of energy that came from too much beer and not enough discipline. Their jackets were black leather, patched with grimy insignia, their heads shaved close on the sides, tattoos running down their necks and across their knuckles. Boots thudded against the wooden floor as they stretched their legs and shifted in their seats. They had been drinking heavily. The table was cluttered with shot glasses, beer bottles, and an ashtray overflowing with cigarette butts. Their laughter had the edge of cruelty, the sharp bark of men who enjoyed making others uncomfortable. Every now and then, one of them would glance at the bar, make a comment just loud enough to carry. The bartender ignored them. At the head of their table sat a man who spoke little, but whose presence anchored the group. He was taller than the others. Though gaunt, his skin pale beneath the flickering lights, his frame angular and sharp. His eyes, though, were what set him apart. They were pale blue and empty, as if whatever had once lived behind them had long since gone silent. His name, or at least the one they used for him, was Bonnie Flash. He didn't laugh with the others. He didn't need to. When he leaned forward, the rest leaned back. When he raised a finger, conversation stopped. For a time, they ignored the new arrival. He didn't fit the pattern they expected from strangers. He didn't glance around nervously or avoid their gaze. He simply sat and drank his coffee, his posture unchanging, his eyes lowered, but not in submission. It was as if he had been waiting for something long before they even knew he was coming. The woman behind the bar continued her work without comment. She poured drinks for the quiet ones, cleaned empty glasses, wiped the surface of the counter with methodical patience. But her eyes kept drifting to the far table and to the lone man in the middle of the room. She knew a storm when she saw it gathering. She'd been in this bar too long not to. Eventually, the inevitable happened. One of the younger bikers, his arms covered in flames and skulls, stood up and swaggered toward the bar. His boots clanged loudly with each step. Deliberately, he slapped a hand on the counter. "Need a refill, darlin'," he said with a crooked grin. The woman didn't look at him. She kept drying a glass. "We're done," she said. He blinked. "What?" "You and your crew. I'm not serving you tonight. Not after last time." He leaned closer, his breath heavy with whiskey and tobacco. "You serious?" Her hand stilled. She looked him full in the face. "I'm tired of cleaning blood off the floor." For a long second, the young man said nothing. Then he laughed, loud and exaggerated. The others joined in, pounding the table. Even Bonnie smiled, just barely. "What's the matter?" one of them called. "We're customers." But the barkeep didn't flinch. She turned her back and placed the glass on the shelf. And that was when they noticed the stranger. The young biker who had approached the bar turned toward the seated man. "Hey, cowboy," he called. "You seen how this lady treats her paying guests?" No answer. "You deaf?" Still nothing. The biker looked back at his friends. "He don't talk much. Maybe he thinks he's too good for us." The stranger didn't move, didn't blink. And then, the woman behind the bar said quietly, "He's the kind of man who knows how to wait." The words landed like a stone in still water. The bikers looked at each other, unsure whether to laugh or bristle. Bonnie's eyes narrowed. The room fell into a silence so dense it felt like a held breath. The stranger sipped his coffee. The jukebox played on, a long, slow slide of blues guitar, fading into the heavy dark. Something had shifted. Something had begun, and it would not end quietly. The silence after the woman's words was not immediate, but rather like the dying tale of a struck bell, a subtle, slow collapse of sound. The blues song sputtered and crackled to a stop, the jukebox giving a weary click as it cycled to the next track, though for a moment, even the machine seemed reluctant to disturb the tension. The stranger, the man with the quiet eyes and the steady breath, finished the last sip of his coffee and set the mug back down on the table with a sound that felt louder than it was. The biker who had been jeering a moment ago stood in place, uncertain. There was something in the stillness of the room now, a shift in pressure, as if the atmosphere itself had thickened. A few of the locals near the window had stopped pretending to play dominoes. One man's hand hovered over a domino piece for far too long, the other clenching his beer in a white-knuckled grip. The old farmer stared straight ahead, eyes vacant, but his ears strained toward the scene. Behind the bar, the woman had returned to wiping down a glass, but her eyes were no longer on her work. They were fixed on the man in the center of the room. The bikers exchanged glances. They weren't used to their performances falling flat. In most places like this, one leer, one sharp word, one heavy boot on a floorboard was enough to command the space. Tonight, it was like throwing pebbles into a canyon and hearing no echo. Bonnie Flash hadn't moved. He leaned back in his chair, elbows on the armrests, fingers draped loosely, like a puppeteer waiting for a string to tug. His face was unreadable. The scar over his brow, a small but old thing, deepened slightly as his eyes narrowed. "He's the kind of man who knows how to wait," Bonnie repeated under his breath, rolling the phrase across his tongue like a stone. "What the hell does that mean?" The younger biker turned back to the woman. "You trying to scare us with riddles now?" She said nothing. Bonnie sat forward and waved his fingers at his crew. "Relax. Let the man drink his coffee." Then to no one in particular, "You see the kind of confidence it takes to just sit in a place like this, surrounded by strangers, and pretend you're invisible? That's interesting. Or suicidal," one of the others muttered. Bonnie's eyes twitched, a subtle flicker. Maybe, maybe not. Another biker, darker skinned, with a buzz cut and a snake tattoo curling around his throat, stood up with a crack of his neck. "I say he's just trying to play the wise old man. One of those stoic types. Bet he'd squeal if we leaned on him a little." The man at the table didn't respond. His expression remained unchanged, a picture carved from patience itself. It wasn't indifference. It wasn't arrogance. It was something deeper, something rooted in silence and years, something that could not be shaken by words or gestures. The snake-throated biker strutted a few paces toward him, then stopped and leaned over, lowering his voice. "What's your game, old man?" he whispered with a sneer. "You one of those washed-up vigilantes? Hiding in dive bars hoping someone recognizes your scars?" "Nothing." "You think being quiet makes you strong," he added louder now, so the room could hear. "You think we're impressed?" No one laughed. Even the jukebox now refused to cooperate, stuck in a buzz of feedback. The bartender looked up sharply. "You don't want to keep poking that man." The biker turned to her, eyes wide. "What's he going to do? Fold me into a pretzel? Put on a show for you all?" She said nothing. Her face was pale, but her jaw was set firm. Bonnie stood up slowly. It was not a dramatic gesture. He didn't slam his hands on the table or draw a weapon. He merely rose, adjusting the cuffs of his leather jacket and stepping out from the shadows of the booth. His eyes drifted toward the stranger. He tilted his head, studying him, as if trying to determine the shape of a dream he'd just forgotten. "You don't drink," Bonnie said. "That's already a mark against you in my book. You sit like a monk, speak like a ghost, and you make my men nervous. I don't like people who make my men nervous." The man at the table finally moved. Just his eyes. Slowly they lifted and settled on Bonnie. "I haven't done anything," he said, his voice low and even. Bonnie smiled. It wasn't a pleasant smile. "Exactly, you've done nothing, and it's pissing us off." The others laughed, but it was forced. There was something brittle in the air now, something ready to snap. The bartender put down the glass she was cleaning and stepped back behind the counter, her hand resting near a baseball bat tucked beneath it. "I tell you what," Bonnie continued, "let's make this simple. We don't want blood on the floor tonight. Neither does our gracious hostess. So we'll give you a way out. No fists, no knives, no shouting." He took a few paces forward. "You get up and you walk out that door," he said. "Simple as that. All we ask is that you walk through us. From here to the door, no eye contact, no fast steps, no reaction. Just a nice, quiet little parade. You do that, and we let you go." The bar fell into utter silence again. Outside, the rain ticked gently against the windows. One of the dominoes fell over with a tiny clack, unnoticed. The man's gaze didn't falter. He looked at Bonnie, then at the others, and finally at the door. He took a breath. Not of fear, but of decision. He stood. The stool scraped against the floor as he pushed it back. His boots planted firmly on the wood, his shoulders relaxed. He didn't speak, didn't frown, didn't adjust his coat or square his fists. He simply began to walk. The group parted slowly, unsure at first how close to let him pass. The first man he approached stuck out a boot lazily, a smug grin forming on his face. The stranger stepped over it without pause, as if navigating debris on a forest trail. Another man hurled an empty bottle so it landed with a sharp crash just beside his heel. He didn't flinch. As he passed the third biker, a hand shot out fast, aimed at his chest. But the man caught it before it made contact. A twist, a pivot, and the attacker was bent double, arm pinned behind his back before he even understood what had happened. No scream, no violence, just control. The stranger released him with a soft push, and the man stumbled back into his seat, rubbing his shoulder with a look of confusion and fear. And still the stranger walked. Bonnie stood just ahead, arms folded, head tilted. His smile had vanished. The man passed within inches of him. He didn't look. Bonnie didn't move. He reached the door and placed a hand on the handle, but he didn't open it. Instead, he paused. And then, in one smooth motion, he turned and walked back to the bar. He sat again at his table, poured himself a glass of water from the jug the bartender placed silently beside him, and drank. The bar erupted into chaos. Chairs scraped, men shouted, boots thundered against the floor. Bonnie raised a hand. "Enough," he said, his voice low. But no one listened. The next moment shattered the illusion of calm as 5 men surged toward the center of the room. The stranger stood up slowly, calmly, as if rising to greet old friends. And the storm truly began. The moment hung suspended in the stillness that followed the stranger's return to his seat. Chairs had shifted, boots had scuffed against the floorboards, and words had been shouted. But now all of that lay behind the veil of what was coming. The man in the center of the room had completed the passage meant to humiliate him. Not only had he walked through the gauntlet untouched in spirit, but he had done so with a dignity that rendered the entire provocation meaningless. And that was something men like Bonnie Flash could not allow. The group around the back table was seething. Their postures were no longer loose and cocky, but taut, their faces darkening under the weight of collective embarrassment. They hadn't expected that. The bottle, the boot, the grabbing hand, all of it had been part of their show, a display of dominance meant to unnerve. Instead, it had exposed something ugly and fragile in them. They had tried to reduce the stranger to an object of ridicule, but now they were the ones being studied, the ones who had failed to make him react. Bonnie remained seated while the others buzzed with frustration. His eyes never left the stranger, who now sat calmly, sipping his water, just as before, as though nothing had transpired. No muscle in his jaw twitched, no tremor in his hands. He didn't look smug or superior. He looked patient. "You think you're better than us?" came the voice of one of the younger bikers, a thick-necked man with a nose that had clearly been broken more than once. His hand clenched around the edge of a stool as though he were trying to keep from hurling it. "You think you're untouchable?" Still, no answer. Another rose, the one with the snake tattoo around his neck, rubbing the wrist that had been effortlessly pinned only moments ago. His pride had been wounded, and pride, especially the kind bolstered by alcohol and youth, was a dangerous thing when bruised. "We gave you a chance," he spat. "Gave you a damn chance to walk." A third one, shorter but stockier, his leather vest stretched over his chest, threw his hands out dramatically. "Guy thinks he's some kind of legend, huh? Comes in here all quiet and mysterious, thinks we'll just bow down." The noise built like a rising wind before a storm. They weren't thinking anymore. They were reacting. The stranger's refusal to be reduced had been the greatest insult. To men who relied on being feared, being ignored was intolerable. Behind the bar, the woman with the scar was watching it unfold with an expression that mixed dread and awe. She had seen her share of bar fights. Hell, she'd cleaned blood off these floors more times than she could count. But this felt different. This felt like the start of something heavier, something irreversible. Bonnie finally stood. He didn't rush. He didn't speak. He walked slowly to the center of the room, his boots tapping a rhythm against the wood. The others stepped back slightly, letting their leader approach. When he came to a stop in front of the stranger's table, the room fell quiet once more. "You didn't take the door," he said simply, almost conversationally. The stranger looked up. "Didn't need to." Bonnie's face twitched, just a flicker at the corner of his mouth. "You're not afraid?" "No." "You should be." "No." There was no heat in the reply, no challenge. It was simply the truth. Bonnie stepped back, folding his arms. "You're making my boys look like fools." "They did that on their own." For a moment, it seemed like Bonnie might laugh. His lips even curled, but the sound never came. He simply turned, gesturing lazily toward the others. "All right," he said. "Let's see how long you stay upright." That was all it took. The man with the broken nose lunged first, roaring as he swept an arm toward the stranger's head. But the stranger wasn't there. He'd already pivoted, fluid and precise, letting the blow pass harmlessly into the empty air. With a minimal shift of weight, he delivered a short, sharp movement to the man's midsection. Not a punch, more a redirecting force, and the man folded, the wind knocked out of him before he crumpled to his knees. The second attacker came from behind, trying to grab him in a bear hug. The stranger stepped forward just enough, dropped low, and spun on his heel. The biker flew over his back in an arc and landed with a thud that shook the floorboards. There was no pause. Another launched in with a wild swing. The stranger caught his wrist midair, turned the arm just enough to twist the shoulder, and let gravity do the rest. The man hit the ground groaning, unable to rise. The bar was no longer just a bar. It had become a theater of movement, of breath, of precise violence and merciful restraint. Chairs tumbled, bottles rolled across the floor. A bar stool skidded across the room and crashed against the wall. But none of it came from the stranger. His movements were clean, efficient. He didn't waste energy. He didn't roar or grunt or strike out in anger. He simply moved through them like wind through brittle branches. His face never changed, not once. He wasn't fighting out of fury or even defense. He was simply ending what they had started. Bonnie did not intervene. He stood back observing, his arms still folded. But the faint, mocking confidence had vanished from his face. His men were his tools, his extensions, and one by one, they were being dismantled, not by brute force, but by control, by discipline, by something that could not be mimicked by patches on a vest or a loud engine between your legs. Eventually, only one stood the last of the group, the one with the snake tattoo, who had hung back, uncertain. He hesitated now, fists clenched, eyes darting between the stranger and Bonnie, as though seeking instruction or permission. None came. The stranger looked at him, not with anger, not even with warning, just a look, and the man sat down. Not out of fear, but out of something deeper. Recognition. The stranger turned his back and walked toward the bar again. His steps were as slow and deliberate as before, as though he were returning to the only thing he'd come for in the first place, a moment of peace. The others groaned on the floor behind him, some clutching ribs, others sitting up with wide, stunned eyes. No one was unconscious. No one was broken beyond repair. But the fight was over. He reached the bar and stood for a moment. The woman didn't speak. She simply placed the coffee pot beside him again, as though the interruption had been no more than a gust of wind that had passed through the room. He poured a fresh mug. Behind him, Bonnie still hadn't moved. The leader's eyes followed the stranger with unreadable calculation. His jaw was tight. The room no longer belonged to him. Not in that moment. Not anymore. The man had passed through their trial and emerged not only unscathed, but unshaken. And the ones who had sought to test him now lay on the floor, their pride splintered like wood beneath a boot heel. But the stranger didn't look at them again. He sat at his table, lifted his cup, and took a slow sip of coffee. The rain tapped on the windows like a gentle applause, and for the first time that night, the bar was truly quiet. No one in the Iron Fang moved. The bar was frozen in the strange limbo that follows violence, the kind where air hangs heavy and breath is held involuntarily, as if the world itself is waiting for the final domino to fall. The stranger sat quietly at his table, coffee in hand, his posture as calm as it had been the moment he walked in. Not a wrinkle disturbed his shirt, not a tremor touched his fingers. Around him, bodies stirred on the floor. Young men once loud and wild, now reduced to groaning silhouettes amid overturned chairs and broken silence. Bonnie Flash stood with his arms still folded, his expression unreadable, but his jaw had tightened enough to show the cords of his neck. He had not moved during the altercation. He hadn't given orders, hadn't shouted, hadn't lifted a hand. But now, in the absence of all motion, in the eerie stillness that followed the dismantling of his group, he shifted. One slow step forward, then another. The sound of his boots on the wooden floor was measured, deliberate. Each step announced his presence as much as his silence had. He walked past his men without looking at them. One sat leaning against the wall, clutching a bruised rib. Another was sprawled on his back, arms wide, blinking up at the ceiling in stunned disbelief. Bonnie ignored them all. His focus was absolute. The bartender had gone still behind the bar. Her eyes followed him, but she didn't reach for the bat beneath the counter. Not yet. She knew this was something that would not be settled by force, not at first. Bonnie reached the center of the room and stopped. His eyes remained fixed on the man at the table. "You made your point," he said, his voice even. The stranger took another sip of coffee, then set the mug down. "I wasn't making one." Bonnie's lips twitched into something that could have been mistaken for a smile, but there was no humor in it. "You humiliated my crew. They humiliated themselves. You did it without breaking a sweat. That wasn't the goal." Bonnie took another step closer, just one, and his voice lowered. "You made me look weak." "No," the stranger replied. "You did that when you told them to stop me." That struck a nerve. A flicker of something sharp passed behind Bonnie's eyes. Shame or rage. Or perhaps the wounded pride of a man who had ruled too long without challenge. He reached into his jacket, but not for a weapon. He pulled out a thin cigarette, tapped it against the back of his hand, and lit it with a silver lighter. The flame danced for a moment before vanishing into smoke. He inhaled, then exhaled through his nose slowly. "You know what I think?" he asked, not waiting for a response. "I think you've done this before. Places like this, towns like this. Strangers like you don't just wander in without knowing what's waiting." The man didn't answer. He didn't deny it. Bonnie chuckled, but it was dry and hollow. "And I think you came here hoping someone would push you. You've been waiting for it, testing us, looking for the excuse." "No," the man said quietly. "I came in for coffee." The line was simple, without irony or humor, but it landed like a blow. For a second, Bonnie's cigarette paused halfway to his lips. The room held its breath again. Then he stepped back. "Fine," he said, and flicked ash onto the floor. "Fine, but we're not done." The bartender's voice cut through the tension like a wire snapping. "Yes," she said, "you are." Bonnie turned to her, slow and deliberate. "Excuse me." "You're done here," she said louder now. "All of you." His face twitched, but she held his gaze without flinching. "Last week," she continued, "you put a boy through that window just because he looked at your jacket. Week before that, you broke a chair over an old man's back. I've cleaned blood off my floor for the last damn time." One of the younger bikers, still sprawled on the floor, muttered, "He spilled a drink on me." The bartender ignored him. "You're not welcome here anymore," she said. "You or your crew. It's over." Bonnie turned back to the stranger. "Is this what you do? You come into places and stir the pot, then leave with the smoke behind you?" "I didn't stir anything," the man replied. "You just weren't ready for silence." Bonnie stared at him, unmoving. Then, without another word, he stubbed his cigarette on the edge of the bar and turned away. He didn't look at the others. He didn't shout or threaten. He simply walked to the far end of the room and took his seat again, in the same booth he'd occupied before. But something was different. Something had changed. He didn't sit like a king anymore. He sat like a man waiting for a sentence. Minutes passed. The bar slowly resumed the quiet rhythm of an interrupted song. The jukebox clicked to life again, offering a low, somber country tune that floated through the room like a benediction. The locals shifted in their seats, murmuring softly. The old farmer took another sip of his drink and stared at the stranger as though seeing something he didn't fully understand. One by one, the fallen bikers pulled themselves upright. Some limped, others leaned on furniture, but none spoke. Their bravado had evaporated. Their swagger was gone. They returned to the booth without fanfare, looking not at Bonnie, not at the bartender, not even at each other. They just sat. The stranger stood again, slowly, and walked to the bar. His steps were steady, unhurried. He poured another glass of water, drank half, then set it down. The bartender said nothing. She handed him a towel. He nodded once, took the towel, and turned back to the room. The silence that followed was different this time. Not tense, but heavy with something that felt like shame. He walked to the first man he'd put down, a young blonde-haired kid who still clutched his side with a wince. The stranger knelt beside him. Without a word, he offered a hand. The kid hesitated, looking at him like he didn't know how to respond. Then slowly, he took the hand. The stranger helped him up, handed him the towel, then moved on to the next. He didn't say anything. He didn't scold or gloat. He just helped. One by one, he moved through them, lifting, checking limbs, wiping blood from lips and brows. The men didn't resist. Some looked away. Others stared at the floor. A few mumbled thanks under their breath, barely audible. But none of them tried to stop him. Bonnie watched it all from his seat, hands on the table, unmoving. His eyes were dark, unreadable. He said nothing. By the time the stranger had finished, the bar looked different. Not just tidy or different. The air had shifted again, not to something triumphant, but something quiet, deeper. The fight hadn't ended with broken bones. It had ended with dignity, with restoration, with something no one had expected. The stranger returned to the bar, handed the towel back to the woman. She took it silently, then reached for a bottle behind her. She poured a finger of something dark and strong into a small glass and slid it toward him. "On the house," she said. He looked at the drink, then at her. "For the floor," she added, "and for the boys." He nodded and took the glass, not as a reward, but as a gesture understood between two people who had seen more than they said. He drank it slowly. Outside, the rain had lessened. The wind had died. The night had settled into its bones and the town lay quiet again. The stranger glanced toward the door, but he did not leave, not yet. He sat one more time at his table, the cup empty in front of him, and rested his hands on the wood. Not tense, not expectant, just waiting. And Bonnie Flash, who had ruled that bar for years with silence and threat, remained seated in his booth, unmoving, his face turned toward a man who had never raised his voice, never made a boast, and never had to, because some men don't need to prove anything. Some men are already what others pretend to be. And nothing threatens a liar more than the presence of the truth. The light from the neon sign outside had grown dimmer. The buzzing red letters of Iron Fang flickered faintly now, as though tired from the weight of the evening. Beyond the windows, the rain had slowed to a mist that hung in the air like breath on cold glass, and the last traces of thunder were nothing more than distant murmurs swallowed by the night. Inside, the bar was still, the kind of stillness that does not invite sound but absorbs it. It was not the peace that followed laughter or music, but something deeper, something earned through fire and silence. The stranger remained seated at his table. His coffee cup sat empty before him, a shallow ring of dark liquid clinging to the bottom. He hadn't touched it since returning from tending to the wounded. There was no need. The ritual had passed. Now there was only stillness. His eyes did not roam. He did not check the door. He simply waited. Bonnie Flash hadn't moved either. He sat in the same position, arms resting on the table, shoulders hunched forward slightly as if bearing the weight of something too heavy to lift. His expression was no longer cold or amused. It had fallen into something closer to recognition, though not yet surrender. The look of a man who had glimpsed the edge of his world and now understood just how fragile it was. Around them, the other bikers occupied their places in quiet disarray. Some leaned against the walls, heads lowered, occasionally lifting a glass of water to swollen lips. Others sat where they'd fallen, legs stretched out, the adrenaline long gone. No one joked. No one cursed. The fight had been taken from them not by fists alone, but by what had followed. The hands that lifted, the silence that forgave. The bartender stood with her elbows on the counter, arms crossed, watching the room with an expression that seemed carved out of stone. There was no triumph on her face, only endurance. This was a woman who had seen too much to be surprised by violence, but not so much that she could ignore grace when it arrived in a stranger's hands. She spoke quietly to the man at the table. "You planning to stay the night?" He looked at her, then shook his head once. "There's a small motel on the edge of town," she said. "Only 2 rooms left. I'd tell you to take the one without mold, but they both have it." He offered the faintest trace of a smile. "I won't be long." She nodded and returned to cleaning a glass, as though that exchange had closed a loop that had been left open since he first walked in. Bonnie finally moved, just a slight shift of his shoulders. Then he stood, slowly, deliberately, and stepped out from the booth. Every eye in the room followed him. Even his own men, who had looked to him for years as something indomitable, seemed unsure now. He did not look at them. His gaze was locked on the man who had undone all of it without raising his voice. He approached the table, each step echoing slightly in the hollow quiet. "I didn't get your name," he said. "You didn't ask," the stranger replied. Bonnie studied him for a long moment. "You military?" "No." "Law?" "No." "Huh. Then what the hell are you?" The man didn't answer, and maybe that silence was louder than any name could have been. Bonnie's jaw flexed. There was no more anger in it, only a need to understand what had just unraveled him so completely. "You could have killed them," he said. "I didn't come for that. You humiliated us. I didn't come for that either." Bonnie leaned a little closer, his voice lower. "Then why did you help them after?" The stranger looked up. There was no pride in his eyes, no sermon behind his expression. "Because someone had to." That was the answer. No more, no less. And Bonnie, for the first time in years, had no response. He stepped back and turned to look at his men. They met his eyes briefly, then looked away. The power he had once wielded over them wasn't gone in a single moment, but it had cracked. And cracks, once formed, do not close on their own. "You can't come back here," the bartender said firmly. "Not tonight. Maybe not ever." Satikurim. Bonnie didn't argue. He didn't threaten. He only nodded and walked toward the door. The others followed, limping, dragging their pride behind them like tattered flags. They did not speak, not even to each other. The last one out, the youngest, the one with the bruise rising across his jaw, paused near the stranger's table. He looked like he wanted to say something. Apology, maybe. Gratitude. But words didn't come. He only gave a small nod, barely more than a twitch of his chin, and turned to leave. The door opened, letting in the cool air of the night. Then it shut, and the bar was quiet again. The stranger stood. He walked to the bar and placed a few bills beside his empty cup. "Too much," the woman said. "Not enough," he answered. She didn't argue. He turned and walked toward the exit. The sound of his boots was softer now, absorbed by the air that no longer needed to tense itself in his presence. At the door, he paused and looked back, not at anyone in particular, but at the room as a whole, as if marking it in memory. Then he stepped outside. The street was nearly silent. The mist caught the soft yellow glow of the old street lamp and turned it into a halo of pale gold. The motorcycles were still there, but they stood like abandoned beasts now, inert and meaningless. The air was clean, sharp with the smell of rain and earth. He crossed the street slowly. His truck waited in the same place, the windshield streaked with water, the hood still cool to the touch. He climbed in, turned the key, and let the engine rumble back to life. The dashboard lit up in dull orange, and the old country song resumed where it had left off hours earlier, scratchy and low. He didn't drive away right away. He sat there watching the bar through the window, the way its neon letters flickered and hissed in the dark. Inside, the bartender would be finishing her shift. The locals would be settling their tabs. Someone might sweep up the broken glass. It would be as though none of it had happened, at least on the surface. But something had changed. The iron fang, long ruled by silence and fear, had met a deeper silence, one forged not from threat, but from discipline, not from rage, but from control. And that silence had won. He put the truck in gear and rolled slowly down the street. No one watched him go. No one needed to. He had not come to be seen. He had come to be, and then to leave. As the town faded in his rearview mirror, the rain began again, gentle, rhythmic, steady. The road stretched ahead, dark and unwinding, and the man who knew how to wait drove on into the night, leaving behind nothing but stillness and the echo of a truth that needed no words. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe for more. Make sure to check out the next videos and explore the rest of the channel. And if this video resonated with you, share it with someone who needs to see it.